I think we're an office that much rather says I prefer to.
Good evening. Welcome. Tonight we're extremely honored to welcome Leonard Streich from Something Fantastic from Berlin. When you see the list of people we invited, you might maybe notice that it's rather eclectic. Each of these persons or each of these offices, we have the feeling, we have the intuition that they could do something with the main title, I Prefer Not To, without saying what it specifically could be. Leo, I mean, we worked a couple of times together, and I think each time Something Fantastic, Belgrade, Leo as a person, in a way confused me in a happy way, kind of where you don't know what's actually happening. And this is also one of the reasons why with the thematic of I Prefer Not To, where I actually don't know what you're going to bring, but that's also a surprise to us then. I think this will be a very good match. So I think without further ado, Leo, the floor is yours, and thank you for accepting the invitation.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you very much for staying so long. And even after all the interesting lectures you maybe saw or could have seen today, decided to come here. What I'm going to show you is, and I mean, maybe if you are kind of a passionate follower of this course, maybe also it's a bit of a boring lecture. I don't know, but I kind of pondered on the I prefer not to statement of the brief, let's say, and in relation kind of to our practice and what we're doing, if that actually somehow applies to us, let's say. And my kind of first reaction was more say I prefer not to. I don't know. I mean, in a way, I think we're an office that much rather says I prefer to. Meaning that we like to deviate rather than to neglect, let's say. But of course, if I then think more about it, that actually does imply a lot of I prefer not to, because just as Bartleby the Scrivener, let's say, does it his way, of course we are somehow also doing it our way, and I guess it's true that we might do have something to contribute to this topic. And the things I would like to show you today is 8 or 9, I guess, simple things. I want to start off with a look into the office yesterday, because I think although we clearly see ourselves as an architectural office, I guess maybe it does deviate a little bit from how most other practices operate. Then I want to show you 3 projects that we have been doing or that we are working on at the moment that prefer not to in some way and prefer in others. Then 5 quick side notes, a bit taking this opportunity just to show you, I think, some things that both influence our architecture, but also even more maybe our stance and position to things in general. And then I want to finish with one house that, for me, somehow is an I could say is an architectural articulation of I prefer not to. In a good way, and in that sense, I think also turns it into a relevant stance. So here it starts with a few pictures from the office, and as you actually see, it's not an architectural drawing you see, but it's an exhibition design that we're finishing right now for an exhibition that's opening up in Montreal at the CCA next Tuesday. Frenetically finishing as we're speaking. On the wall, you see one-to-one layouts of that as well in the space. You also see actually an architectural model in production here at the moment. I will show you that house later. And you see the design for a book cover of a book that we were doing with the ETH as well, with our course here that's going, or that went into print today. So I guess that is somehow deviating from the normal practice as well. And as a matter of fact, we actually did start the office with finishing our studies in a way, with saying no to doing a project, an architectural project, but we instead did this book as our final thesis. But again, it was not really. I don't prefer to do. I prefer not to do an architectural project, but it rather just happened to become. I prefer to do a book. And I think that is, somehow at the essence of how we operate. Which brings us into the second part. And the first project I quickly want to show you is the German Pavilion on the Architectural Biennale 2016, which was one of the projects that I had to think of in relation to that title as well. On the left, you see the German Pavilion before our intervention, how it normally looks, and on the right-hand side, you see it after the intervention. It's not much different. It has 3 little openings more than it usually has. But to us, kind of this, let's say, small intervention totally changed the spatial configuration of that building, and somehow turned the pavilion that usually is kind of a cul-de-sac of the Giardini into something that was exposing actually that beautiful location that the pavilion has, right at looking out onto the canal. And if I relink it again to Bartleby the Scribner, I guess in a way here you see a very there's not very much designed things in this pavilion. It's kind of more of a performance in a spatial way, but then also very pragmatically kind of thinking what does a visitor of a biennale somehow need and lack. Since, I didn't talk about this now, I didn't tell you, but the exhibition itself tried to understand what a good arrival city, a good immigrant neighborhood offers in order for people immigrating somehow being able to integrate themselves into a certain context. And what it all kind of boils down to is a kind of accessibility. It needs to be close to jobs. It needs to be affordable, and so on. And that was what we somehow tried to do with that pavilion then, and that was mainly the intervention. Next to kind of having the 10 theses on the wall as a kind of, I guess, also political agenda, since the German pavilion is actually not commissioned by the Ministry of the Arts in Germany, but by the Housing Ministry, the Building Ministry. So the people that commission the pavilion are actually also the people that are directly responsible for spatial policy in Germany. Here's the kind of a little trick. I mean, basically, all of the design was trying to adapt the thinking of these arrival cities, which usually are somehow trying to get the problem solved as possible, as quickly and as easily as possible. And since we put in those holes and there were no doors to close it, obviously somehow the pavilion was open. It was open always, also during the night. And the crane here we used as a kind of smart move from the construction site, where they put all the valuables, all the tools that they still want to have the next morning, and just heave them up onto the crane. So that was where the computer and the money and all these things then were. The next project is, you could really say, is not an architectural project at all in a way, but I think it highlights one of our beliefs that the answer to a spatial problem is not necessarily always a new building. And it was a commission to do a fashion show for also small labels, so the budget was not big, but nonetheless we somehow thought, okay, we can't do much with that money, so why don't we, instead of trying to build the perfect place, let's say, or to why don't we just kind of look for the perfect place, let's say, and then somehow had to think of the Mies van der Rohe's Neue Nationalgalerie, which obviously as well, if you want to rent it in normal terms, we didn't have the money to do that either. It's about 50,000 euros, I think, a day or so. But we then were thinking, okay, well, it has this large roof, and it's kind of a public building. It's a museum, so couldn't we actually just buy the tickets for the models and have like kind of invite the 500 people or 1,000, how many it were, just to stand around that pavilion, and that's what we then somehow did. Created a choreography for the models to walk through the objects that were in the exhibition. We had the location of the show sent out, I think 12 hours before or so. And then you had kind of, you could say, misused the gallery space, but also created a double use of a kind that we find super interesting. And you had the models walking on the inside and the people walking on the outside. And it was somehow the perfect space for that show at the price of 21 tickets, I think, for the show. And in our opinion, at least as great. This was kind of 15 minutes before the show. This was 5 minutes into the show. And this was 15 minutes after the show had ended. So it kind of in less than an hour, we did one of the most highly received shows of that fashion week without any waste, basically, in the end. But only kind of deviating slightly from the perceived condition of how one should operate and what one should do. The third thing I'm showing you is now actually a kind of an architectural project, and it's a project we are working on right now. And it's again deviating in that sense that actually we are our own clients. Sometimes happens. But we also are actually looking for sites that are no sites. This is kind of just a quick recommendation. I think a book that somehow influenced that house a bit, because it exactly was trying to balance community and privacy in a flexible way. I will read you these little notes there, and I hope that you understand how the building functions, and explain it further. The bench surrounding the ground floor is a pangadavia, where since the first day house dwellers and neighbors sit, chat, and have a drink. All 4 day spaces, occupying half a floor each, were equipped with the same kitchen. Of 16 private night rooms, 12 were actually used as bedrooms in the first years of the project. The others were for reading, working, or guests. Only on one floor, one of the initial dwellers, a couple with a young kid at the time of moving in, connected 2 night rooms through a larger bathroom. After the kids that had grown up together in the possibility house had moved out, most of the rooms were rented out to foreign students. The long table on the common penthouse floor was often used for doing homework together. The shared top floor and the night room below. So it is kind of a communal house that tries to adapt to a lifetime, you could say, or to specific situations, without kind of compromising too much on the privacy nor on the community. And how it works is that it has, you could say, 4 typical floors. A service floor on the ground floor, communal floors that are open floors, and then it has day floors and night floors, and those always interchange. And by kind of splitting the functions of what you do at night and what you do at day, we believe, or we think that somehow you get a building that is incredibly flexible, because the building is supposed to be good initially for families, and each family has 1 night floor and half a day floor, and the night floor actually has something that looks kind of resembles a hotel room, you could say. So it is somehow in a way breaks up the familiar nucleus in that sense that the kids theoretically really have complete privacy as well, at least during the night. And then in the morning you kind of meet in half of your day floor. But because these floors are so private, you could say, you actually can use as many of them as you somehow need to use. You could also just use one of them. And you could either give the others to one of the other family members if they have more kids or need more space, or rent them out, or use them as guest rooms or whatever. But the idea or our hope is basically that by doing that you have a building that is always just right in size, let's say, that has the large space if you need it on top, but it is something you share. And it has as many rooms as you need for having guests or for family, or then also later on again when the family is shrinking, the kids are moving out, you somehow can make use of those rooms again in a different way, and you somehow have an apartment that can go from 35 square meters to 300 and back again in a way. And here you have a little chart with a lot of different constellations that I'm not going to go into that much, but and then in the end we come to the part of like finding the plot for this building, which this is the plot we that's the plot we designed the place for, a plot that we wanted to buy, a kind of a difficult little plot in between socialist GDR area, slab construction, and a little leftover of the 19th century city structure that you see there. And on top there is actually a Vattenfall heating distribution station on that plot. So that was kind of the only reason why we might be able to buy that plot. In the end, we weren't able to buy it either. But the building was kind of came out of this plot and the negotiation that we had with the city in thinking about and bidding for this plot. And now, since we did not get that, we're currently kind of looking for a new site for it. And of course, Berlin has a lot of areas like this that have exactly these conditions, and we somehow are now engaging with the city to see if there isn't a possibility to actually densify areas like this with kind of a quite dense but slender tower. So we are somehow looking for plots that aren't really plots. And in that sense, I guess, again, are somehow deviating from the normal way of doing things. Which already brings me to part 3 here. And I think, as it says up there, that these are a few observations, mainly through journeys that we have made with the ETH, that kind of have influenced the buildings before, or the projects you saw before. Theoretically, what you see here is the train from a mine in the Amazonas forest in Brazil that goes to the coast. It's an iron ore mine. It's the largest open pit iron ore mine in the world. And it has 300 train cars, which actually should run through here now, but they don't. But you can somehow imagine it is. It's a large, a very large train, and it runs once every hour from this iron ore mine to the coast, 24 hours a day. So 300 train cars each hour, 24 hours a day, 365 days a week. And actually, the iron ore from this mine is around 30% of the yearly iron ore that is harvested. So that statistically means that kind of like, I mean, every third metal product that you see somehow has been on that train cart. So not that metal pole, not that metal pole, but this one, and so on, right? And kind of seeing that and visiting that that mine was one of the, I think for us, crucial experiences where we, in a way, understood, okay, the world is large, but the world is also very small, and somehow I think that has a a very big influence on how we are thinking about our projects, and on what somehow is interesting for us in architecture. The second picture, or the second thing I wanted to show you is this like little canopy in a side street in Cairo, in an informal settlement or informal area that is not so informal in Cairo, but nonetheless. And to me, that picture, or kind of the way the owner has painted, let's say, exactly as much as he can see from his canopy or from his window, but that's somehow very pristine and white and clean in this kind of otherwise very dusty area. Holds an extreme beauty somehow in the simplicity of it, but also in how would you say, yeah, kind of in the reduction of means that somehow form this, but also kind of, I think, the intention of it that becomes much more obvious once it's not the whole house that is painted, but kind of just that little part that he could afford or wanted to afford, but still somehow made an effort to give somehow a kind of beautiful cleanliness that the area otherwise does not have, and to somehow just mark exactly that territory that he can see. The third thing is from last week, actually, where we were in Tangier with our students, and that was really somehow, let's say, a total revelation, because this apartment that we visited here in Tangier by a local family basically had one type of room 3 times. It had 3 rooms with sofas in them, and that was basically everything that was in those rooms. And it kind of with our preconceived idea of how an apartment is and how you use space, you were walking through that thing and you were for sure missing a bedroom, but in a way also all other kinds of rooms that we somehow adhere to. And this place was really small. I mean, it was like maybe maximum 50 square meters, I would say, probably less, and 1/4 of it was a veranda, but it had kind of this perfect double programming that was unseen of to me in a way, where I mean the sofa was basically good for everything. You eat there, you converse there, and later on you sleep there, and you do it all together somehow. And this is kind of the double usage of things is something that I think we are very much interested in, but I have never, actually this was somehow very extreme, but also somehow nice. And I guess I brought it to this lecture again because it was maybe kind of a similar moment as wondering about Bartleby's behavior, let's say, is when you read the book. The fourth or fifth thing here from my list is this Panca da Via, which you also saw in the project in Berlin, in its original location, which is in Florence, in this case in the Palazzo Rucellai, where the Rustica just kind of branches out at the end and does this little bench at the end. And by doing so, totally reshaping the public space that is in front of it, because there is all of a sudden a very private, let's say, border that is drawn. But by this private drawn border extending out, it shapes the public space in front of it in a hospital way somehow. It somehow is offering something to a larger public, let's say. And I think this is also kind of a crucial component of architecture as a discipline. What do you do for the house, let's say, but what is the house doing for its surrounding, no? And then kind of a last thing here in this section are actually artist studios, because like when we were thinking of the brief, we were thinking, okay, yeah, what do we prefer not to do actually, and and there is a few peculiar things. I think like we don't do very many competitions, actually nearly none. Not that it is a very conscious decision, let's say, but somehow it's just not so tempting to us in some way, which maybe also has to do with the fact that having a large office is also not necessarily so tempting to us. And I think we are trying to somehow operate, maybe not as much actually as the artist studio, but to take it back to Bartleby, the scrivener, maybe a little bit like a writer, where you I think we're somehow fascinated by the idea that you can, by just using a pen and a piece of paper, can create something like that, and you don't need much for that. And I think we somehow try to operate within architecture without necessarily trying to create an office that can do everything, let's say, or is dragging you down. And then finally, I quickly want to show you a house that you might know or might not know. It's partially done by Peter. It's the art economy house by 51N4E, built in 2012 for a couple in their 50s or 60s, I guess. And it's somehow a house that I had to think of when I was reading the book, and it's the house somehow is doing a lot of things not somehow. First of all, I guess maybe that was one of the most radical decisions. It did not tear down the house that the clients had lived in before, which was this kind of like country house style from the early 80s. That somehow, wouldn't go with any cliche of what an architectural office, I think, would want to renovate or work with, that takes itself serious in 2010 or 8 or 5, or when the clients first came. And the second thing it does, it creates somehow a border around the building, but it's a border that you can't close. So here it's a corrugated metal sheet, and it somehow looks like it's creating a border, but you can't really close it. It's like, in terms of protection, it's useless. But obviously, what it does is it creates a layer of space around the house that is really an architectural experience. But it somehow it feels unrational on first approach to it. The further intervention is that the house was kind of cut out. That's the two big interventions that were done: enclosing it, cutting it open, but somehow leaving it there. But then, like when you get to know the inhabitants, you somehow you learn and you understand that somehow this is, although it seems like such an irrational building in a way, it's the perfect building. Actually, this is one of the projects that Peter and I worked together on. We then designed a book for that house, and just as you can't really close that metal fence, and it always leaves a little gap. You also cannot really close the book, and it always leaves a little bit of a white opening there as well. That might seem irritating if you don't fully comprehend the building that the book is about, but if you somehow understand it, you also understand that that's just the way it should be, I think. And to kind of end with a new story. That's actually the first sentences from that book, and it's the last slide for the presentation. And I maybe have a question. At this end, and that concerns, I guess, the lecture series in itself, but also your decisions, Peter, and it's kind of it's a very simple question, but I guess a difficult answer. If you decide to do something differently, how do you somehow grow it that it has a larger impact? That's the question. Yeah, I repeat the question. I'll rephrase it. I mean, I think my question, or I mean, the question, I think partially I know the answers from, but I think, I mean, we are, in a way, I mean, our office is, I think, deeply concerned with architecture also, and its impacts also in a larger, in a much larger field than, let's say, how this one little house is, or that house, or whatever, but kind of as a social force that is shaping our society in a way. Yet we have a very little office that has, you could say, little to none impact just by being so small. Yet you, on the other hand, had a quite large office, which had a little bit more impact, but decided to say no to that.
Well, maybe there's also, because what I saw also tonight, and this may be also a kind of constant search, this sense of deviation. Mm-hmm. Which actually I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's, let's say, inherent to the practice. I don't think it's something that you look for.
No.
No. And each time you do it,
unconsciously.
Yeah, but each time you do it, and I think it's also important that it's not something that is too conscious, that is not theorized. So the things, for instance, I saw tonight. I mean, this is maybe also one of the reasons why I said no to another practice environment. I think this is a very essential way of practicing, of being concerned, of focusing, which very often, I mean, you don't have time for or whatever. There's always an excuse not to do it. And to be honest, I mean, actually, I haven't seen many lectures before of the office. What I saw tonight, and I'm not sure, I mean, I would like to see more.
I can tell you, I'm by far the worst lecturer of the three of us.
No, but I would like to see more, because not to define, let's say, a kind of pattern, but for instance, the project Pereshat. I knew the project and I didn't know the logic behind it. So another question then maybe arises that, of course, now we have a kind of lecture session or lecture setup, which allows you to explain some things. But what are interesting ways and crucial ways to communicate such an approach? This very subtle sense of deviation, that it doesn't become freakish or doesn't become kind of a small joke, or, I mean, because I think an important part of the practice is also, for instance, publishing, layout. Is that something that is consciously linked to that, or it's also, I mean, how do you communicate such a very subtle, complex practice.
Yeah, I mean, actually, that's again very funny because I mean, we really in the practice are thinking a lot about how to communicate architectural ideas or how to tell these stories. But then on the other hand, we are actually also not very interested in the things that we have done before. So actually, we are not thinking so much about that. I think we're very much into doing things and a lot less about what we have done before. So I think, I mean, that maybe it's also not so important that you can tell that story, or that you don't. I mean, if you just see it in the pictures and you don't understand it, that's maybe also fine. I mean, kind of, I guess the thinking itself is something that we would like other people to use as well, but it's not. It's good in itself if it was done like that somehow, but yeah, I mean, in general, if it's about communication, of course, it's the simpler the better usually.
Yeah. A simple question then, maybe somebody. No? A question? Do you still have a question?
Another question. Yeah, actually, are you all at Peter's studio? No?
Luckily not.
No. How many are?
But they have a midterm crit tomorrow, so they.
Yeah. I also see Lucas. I don't see Lucas, for example.
No.
Who? There he is. Yeah, Lucas actually worked on this project as well when he was still working with us. Or actually, he's still working with us. Yeah, I don't know if I mean, actually, I would have some questions. But I maybe also want to make a statement to all of you who are at Peter's studio, because I think you're. To me, it's. I would say you're in the most interesting studio at the school, although there are so many great studios here to be had.
And why would that be then?
I think because I mean.
I'm going to say that.
I think exactly because of the choices that you have made, in somehow, or also what I guess you're still wanting to do, but kind of to let's say give up. Like the standard architecture dream, let's say, of having a well-running practice to go into politics or into the policy side of this equation, I think is that's kind of the only. I think kind of the only decision in architecture that I really admire, and I think something that we as architects should do much, much more.
But maybe also coming back, because at a certain point you said you don't do a lot of competitions, which is, I think, kind of similar, maybe rejection. And why is that? Because I think you could perfectly function within this kind of... and again, mainly competitions are seen as a kind of the biggest part of practice, I think. No, if you understand architectural practice, I think most offices practices get their work through competitions. You say, well,
we don't do
almost casually, like, well, we don't do it that much.
Yeah,
which is, I think, a very also a powerful way of saying I prefer not to. But yeah, is it intelligent to say? I mean, why not competitions?
Yeah, somehow they just don't appeal very much to us. I mean, it's somehow we have the feeling if we do, but what kind of appeals to us is thinking about projects we would like to do, and then to try to find a person for it. And somehow the idea of participating in a competition that has a certain set of rules you're supposed to follow, and I think it's also very difficult to somehow break out of that, is just not that appealing to us. It's as simple as that. But on the same time, I mean, that's also something where then, in a way, I'm also a little bit questioning ourselves, because of course that is somehow, I mean, that in a way means that we are doing, the impact is maybe much smaller than it could be.
For instance, Possibility House.
Yeah.
I think it's the first time I saw it, and it's I think a very interesting project and process. I think you owe it to yourself in a way to try to complete the process as far as possible. Yeah. Because if it's only a project, and maybe you don't find the site, it's just a big potential that you don't find the site. But I mean, for me, the most important part is almost what do you need to do in order to, this project that you started yourself, to get it out there, to make it public. And public, I mean by building it. Because otherwise, I think it's maybe not so an interesting exercise. I mean, I do like the logic behind it. But
of course, no.
I think it's really necessary that it gets realized, and maybe a couple of those,
Yeah.
No?
No, of course, it's about doing the things. No, I think.
What do you think? I mean, you saw a Possibility House? What were your thoughts about this? What were your thoughts about the Possibility House? That it's possible?
I was wondering if the three clients are yourself.
I'm coming, Michel.
If the three clients are ourselves?
I was wondering if the three clients are yourself. I mean,
yeah, it's like half of it is ourselves. So actually my two partners are married, and yes, they would have 1.5 floors of that. and the other party would be me and my wife. But there's also 2 others. But I mean, they are close friends as well. I mean, it is kind of it's a very pre-selected group to try this with.
Because when I saw, the question was, what did you think about the project? And when I saw it, I thought that, okay, if it's the 3 architects and each of them has a floor, it could be a nightmare, like living and working with the same people. And there's something dystopian of that there is no separation between work and private life. There is a kind of, and that you're yourself the client. It's a very total way of doing architecture, which it's very scary for me, but also fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, that's true. There's many people that say you somehow need a brief to be an architect, no?
At the same time, you could imagine that it's for somebody else, no?
Yeah, I mean, we would think that it is for some, that it could be for many, actually. We are actually also kind of interested in the, now that we have done this one, in kind of this in this shape. And we're starting something with the city of Geneva, where we're looking kind of for density without bigness. And I think a kind of a building of this size could maybe exactly be that. And I think, we did a book on communal housing this year, where a lot of communal projects were some more analyzed, and I think there's very little of them in which we actually could imagine to live, and at the same time we are doing or trying to do a communal building as well. But I think it's really very crucial who you're building that community with, no?
And I all of a sudden start to question who will be on the first floor and the second floor.
Yeah, I don't think.
That's not a sound.
Yeah, that's also a question. But I don't think it matters so much. I mean, since the fore plate is so good, all rooms are corner rooms at least. So.
Okay. Thank you again, Leo. Much appreciated. I would like to invite you next week already for the third lecture in the series, which will be Andri Sala, Albanian artist who lives also in Berlin, who will have a talk with Andreas Ruby. So first we'll show one or two of his films, and then we'll have an open discussion with Andreas. Who's, of course, in that sense, now I realize, also connected, for instance, because the book you showed, your thesis, was also published by Ruby Press, the publishing house of Andreas Ruby, and Ilka Ruby. So we stay in a family in a way, but that's also nice. Leo, thank you again. See you next week.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.